Hi, I'm Nimrod, and I'm here to talk to you about this new emerging paradigm in SaaS that will change how we work in our software tools in the next decade. And I promise you, by the end of it, if you believe me, you're going to have the tools to jump on that wave and to benefit from being an early mover and having the right map in front of you. And this wave I'm calling team-led growth because it's a refinement riding on the coattails of product-led growth, which most of you have heard so much about, you're probably sick of it by now. But before we start, I'll tell you how I learned about team-led growth and why I chose to dedicate basically all of my time to that. So it starts when I was a PM at Facebook. At Facebook, we naturally worked a lot on mapping out the dynamics that play out in communication products. How many users an average user invites, what helps users invite others, how does a product spread through a network of users like a school or a town, and how much these network effects are entrenched, or when do users churn and move to another app. But anyway, this world of messaging dynamics and growth mainly, we were part of the growth team, fascinated me and was my entire world for almost 6 years. And I became immersed in how the details and affordances that communication products differ in, how these lead ultimately to different growth trajectories. But all this was B2C. Then I left Facebook and I advised a few companies that were B2B SaaS tools. A big MarTech tools for mobile marketers, fraud analysis SaaS that IPO'd recently, and a cybersecurity SaaS that's worth multiple billions of dollars in the last valuation. So big successful companies, they had their self-serve and sales-assisted growth motion. They had, the making of or wanted to improve their product-led growth, and they were sold to businesses. They were used in teams. And there were people working all day long inside the fraud analysis tool in different roles, managing cases. There were people in the MarTech tool overseeing campaigns, growth managers and marketers and PMs and so on. But the tools themselves were single player. They weren't talking in the tools or working together. They were chatting away in Slack channels, copying screenshots and links to discuss the work. And that's obvious to us. This is the state of B2B SaaS. And I looked around, and Okta says the average SME uses over 90 different SaaS tools. And guess what? The vast majority of these are single player. And communication all gets stuffed into one of a few channels, Slack or MS Teams or email. Except guess what? There are SaaS tools that did incorporate communication. We're going to talk about some of these today. And lo and behold, if the tool is good and the communication is good, then they go absolutely ballistic. Because teams want to talk where they work. And we'll talk about why. And so that's where that collaboration first cohort of tools that just got started now in the last couple of years really started getting traction. The most known examples being Figma or Notion. But there are many other amazing multiplayer products. Like a friend of mine is working on a collaborative BI tool called Hex.tech. There's Pitch.com, which is a remaking of PowerPoint in a collaboration first way. And there are many others where the collaboration is a key part of their growth. So this brought me back to the interest in how communication apps grow, but now in the business context, where the networks are not schools or countries, they're teams and businesses. And the equivalent of texting photos to each other is actually how do you use a SaaS tool as a team? Now, let's be honest, this isn't a side hobby for me. I have a dog in this fight. I started Cord because I was so interested in and fascinated by this shift. So we help other SaaS become collaborative. But I'm not going to sell you our solution here. I'm not going to mention us. What I'm going to tell you about is if you're a PM considering adding collaboration to your tool, what you should do. I'm going to lay out all of our learnings and observations from the market and from tools that did it well and those that screwed it up, and give you the toolkit to think about where and how collaboration fits for you. And then you decide if you want to build it in-house or talk to us or talk to our competitors that provide similar solutions, or you want to just ignore this trend and wait it out. And I think it's just such a part of our lives today in the tools we work on that it's going to be at the very least sort of tickle your product taste buds, because we're going to get really nicely into the frameworks and the problem and solution spaces for this very universal thing, which is multiplayer team software. Ready? Well, here we go. So what explains how Figma went from 0 to over 4 million users in 4 years, overtaking well-established favorites with, at the time, much richer functionality, like InVision, Sketch, and XD. And how did Canva skyrocket to almost 60 million users, Notion to 4 million, and Airtable to 250,000 customers? Now, I'm not going to claim it's just due to collaboration. I have many examples, and we'll go over them, of collaboration done wrong. And these are exceptional tools with excellent marketing and a very good product-led growth motion. But that light was shed on all of them before by people who are experts in product, marketing, and self-serve trial to paid motions. What I didn't see enough is discussion about their inherent social communication aspect. You could easily imagine Airtable without its collaborative features, or Figma without commenting and cursors. Hell, that existed and it was called Sketch. Communication seems obvious in these products today, but it wasn't until they came around, and they executed it so well that it made them displace well-based incumbents. So let's dive into team-led growth. To define it, I'm going to contrast it with two other well-known and still widely used motions: sales-led and product-led growth. You know sales-led as the classic top-down motion, which is still driving much of the returns, and pretty much any big company, even if it started product-led, layers sales on top once it's big. And so I would say in sales-led growth, your focus is, sales. That's the metric, new revenue that you go on and pay spiffs or incentives on. And who do you engage? You talk to the buyers, the champions, a small part of the eventual user base of the software that's essentially just the stakeholders. Product-led growth, on the other hand, is bottoms up and is primarily about using forms of freemium or free trial to start usage, and then automated onboarding and product feature or usage tiers that lead you in a self-serve way to paid usage. So of course, new revenue is still measured, but a big focus is now on conversion from free to paid. That's a big measure of the success in PLG. And one of its great insights is that you engage the end user. This is why we get such a different focus and style in the communications we get from product-led SaaS vendors. Suddenly, dark mode matters a lot. It wouldn't usually get into a sales deck or a sales demo, but it's all over email newsletters and PLG. We have dark mode, or we have this and that features that matters a lot to the end user. Well, with that framework in mind, team-led growth is a subset of the bottoms-up motion. I look at it really as a subset, an articulation inside product-led. But it's the articulation that is about goaling on expansion and retention. So expansion and retention, after you've converted to paid, what now? You want more of the target's company's users on the platform, either because you monetize it directly through seat-based or usage-based pricing, or because it indirectly leads to better engagement and retention. And you want retention because every good B2B business leader knows that retention is king. It's the metric that matters most by far to the long-term profitability and growth of the business. You can't grow a leaky bucket. Just to demonstrate this, though surely you've had this point hammered to you 1,000 times before, this is stolen from Bessemer Ventures, who, spent 3 decades investing in B2B SaaS. And they have this chart of how just a 2% difference in retention rate over 5 years makes up 50% difference in ARR. So big outcome from that small influence. If being adopted by more users in your client's company ends up being just a tiny bit stickier, like more people to talk to when you have to rip it out, that's a big impact down the line that's equal to selling again half of all your sales. So let me tell you a personal story to illustrate this. At some point when I worked at Facebook, I was negotiating our contract with Comscore on the buyer side. It was a big multi-million-dollar contract renewal, and I was trying to cut them out almost entirely. Basically, cut their SaaS components and just buy their data. So they sent me a list of all the Facebook employees who were active on the platform in the past year. And let me tell you, it's not fun having to email 300 people around the world, some are VPs of their departments and regions, to tell them that I want to stop them from using that product. So, expansion matters even if you don't charge per seat. But the second thing that is essential is that you engage more than just the core user of your app. This is super critical. And think about it. In the sales-led motion, you engage the stakeholders that sometimes weren't even using the app. In product-led growth, your product essentially engages its users. And in team-led growth, you engage both and more people. You bring in more people who aren't potential users of your app. They're not the core role. They're not going to know and understand everything about the app. And to this day, they might not have even heard of it. But they are involved in the workflow that your app is a part of. They're interacting with the operations or projects that a core user does inside your app. And that's a really important point, a real unlock here that we're gonna hammer on later. Cool. So we know why we need retention. We know expansion helps retention, not to mention revenue from higher usage or seats. And we understand team-led growth focuses on expansion and arguably also helps retention and sales because a collaborative product is just superior in what it lets the end users do to a product without it. But how? How do I magically cause my users to invite teammates to the product? So here's what we learned about team-led growth from our partners and our research. There are 4 rules. You want to think deeply about the invite flow. You want to create network effects. Then you want to expand the surface area of your app. And finally, you want to create cross-site network effects. So let's talk about these one by one. First, invites. Most tools stick invites into the add seats or add members part in the settings, or even lock it to just admins. But the best team-led growth tools don't do that. They do something entirely different and exactly the same between all of them. Just look how copycat these invite dialogues from Figma and Notion and Pitch are. What they do is they essentially give away from any single item, like a page or an object in your SaaS tool, to share that and to essentially give lightweight seats to whoever was shared just for that document. They give you a way to do it over email, through a link, by embedding an iframe into a web page, and the best of them also give you a way to do it over Slack. They want to make it incredibly easy to invite people. Secondly, they give people a reason to invite. If I invite you to look at my work, what is that for? Well, you could conceive of all kinds of reasons, but 99% of the time, it's for communication. It replaces taking a screenshot and sending it over Slack. It's about communicating or collaborating in context. And that's another big topic that we're going to go into later. So save that thought. Now, you remember I said you need to engage more than just the core user of your app? Why is that? Well, all designers use Sketch already. Your core users already bought and are using the tool. They have a seat. They don't need an invite system to copy a link and send it over. What happens though is that most jobs products do are a small piece of a long workflow. This is an example from Canva's board deck about how the design process looks like and how Canva's collaboration functionality expands the roles it serves. And that's virtually always the case. Recording sales data in a CRM is a tiny piece of scheduling a sales call, checking the prospects, refreshing on sales materials, sending the post-call notes, signing the docs, etc. And running queries in a dashboard is a tiny piece of the discussion that goes about the data in slide decks and channels and conversations with a ton of people that don't usually even have a login to the dashboard. And that workflow is your natural invite opportunity, your natural next users to engage that aren't your core users. And yes, Figma's brilliant win, like all brilliance, looks frankly stupidly obvious in retrospect. Designers get feedback on their designs from non-designers. That's it. Designers need to involve non-designers in their designs to get feedback, like PMs or front-end engineers. What if we let them invite these non-designers into the tool with a comment or seat to just leave comments there? It helps our users, it grows our usage, our stickiness in the org grows. Bam. So this brings us directly to the second rule, network effects. And this is an amazing visualization from Figma about exactly this motion how Figma spreads in an org from designer to non-designer colleagues. They used pre and post-COVID here, to be honest, I think just to ride the news cycle when they released this, but it happens in every org that adopts Figma. Why? Because there are network effects. The more people who already give comments in Figma cause the value of giving comments in Figma to increase. You're part of the conversation and not a separate thread. And that makes it very, very hard to not just pull in everyone who might have had anything to do with the design project into Figma. And again, this isn't a drug. The tool is good. Or, well, maybe it means it's a great drug then. You get introduced through that invite, that network effect. You bet they're going to recommend that tool in the next company that they move to or start. It's contagious. So you see now why I'm so excited about this. I told you how I spent almost 6 years exploring the same things at Facebook when Messenger rolled out country by country, and just seeing this in the context of business is incredible for me. So what makes good network effects? Well, you have to think of the residual value. If I invite people and no one else but me and the invitee benefit from the invite, that's nice, but it won't really trigger these massive cascades of invites. It'll just stay sporadically used. The key here is that the next invite has an even more reason to invite another person. And nothing does this better or more universally than communication. All the key network effects examples are communication apps for a reason. We have to communicate where others already do. Cool, so let's move on. So how do I make these invites and network effects take greater hold? Well, expand the surface area of your product. If your product lives just in the browser tab in your URL and you don't cast as wide a net to capture attention as you can. When you think team-led growth, your product has value for more than the core user. It's like you need to develop this small kind of marketing approach inside the org that you already penetrated. Your clients use other tools. Integrate with them. Integrate with Slack, with their task managers, with Zapier, and other tools up and down the chain, because it'll give you a place to capture all of these team members that aren't seats, but will now have more opportunities to run into your product and recognize it and click and go and experience it as a viewer. And then, if you follow the rest of what we talked about, also communicate there and stick around. So the false optimization that I see PMs doing is measuring engagement inside their own product's UI. They don't count all the users that saw it in Slack. So you know PMs, that work doesn't move the metrics, so it doesn't get prioritized. Instead, what you want to optimize for is the times that people encounter your product, anywhere. And of these, Slack is the most valuable and most well known, but the second most valuable and underlooked ones are task managers. In the end of the day, everything the users are doing in that workflow is a part of a project or an operation, and it's almost always tracked in task managers. And your users are already creating tickets that say, do X in awesome SaaS. And they reassign it and mark it as done and link to the object in your product sometimes. And all the task managers have great APIs you can really richly interact with from your tool. We have a report up on our website. You can look at the popular task managers and decide which to integrate first. Finally, the real superstar move. By the way, this is again behind the success of Figma and Canva specifically. The really slam dunk top dog move is to use cross-site network effects. And this means you hop between org and org. You don't just work on expansion through invite inside companies, you let people invite and work with other folks in other companies. Because that is how this stuff really just becomes product-led word of mouth. Now, this is hard to pull off, but a great and relatively generalizable way to leverage this is agencies. So in Figma, they gave it to design agencies who preferred leaving comments inside Figma boards as a way of getting client feedback rather than enormous chains of emails with points and subpoints and replies and whatnot, referring to all kinds of minute details in the design. And we've also seen with Cord, the easiest for us was selling to SaaS vendors that used agency resellers. What happens is, in a regular company, the VP isn't really that fussed about getting a Zoom together to discuss something in, say, a BI dashboard. It's easy to get everyone's time. A part of it is sort of socially important, and it's just a price that's easy to ignore. But when you're an agency working with a client, on both sides, everything is just stacked against inefficient communication. So the incentive is to communicate effectively in product where the comments are all contextual and point to the right thing and can be separately back and forth right there and then, and there's clarity on who said what and when and who saw it and so on, and what changed since you were last there. That's just suddenly incredibly valuable. There's an ROI against it because the client either pays for the hours or it's a cost for the agency in a way that's just not inside a company. So enabling that collaboration beyond the seats you sold and having that complex tenancy is hard, but it's also very conducive to growth. Maybe we shouldn't have called it team-led growth. It goes beyond your team. Is it invite-led growth? I'm not sure. Anyway, so we spoke about team-led growth, and in theory, you can imagine just figuring out for your specific product, why would users invite others into your product, and how is there a network effect there, and how to use it for cross-site effects. But there's a shortcut. There's basically one killer app for team-led growth here that fits nearly all scenarios, and that's communication. So, people talk about work. Well, what do people talk about when they talk about work anyway? It sounds like a silly question, right? Well, it turns out you can divide the communication into a pretty small set of categories. People talk either in general, or most ICs, most of the time, talk about work-based items, the stuff that they need to further inside these, SaaS tools that they work in. And what they need is they need help because they're stuck and unsure how to proceed in the task, or they need approval, or they need feedback, or they need to hand off the work they did to the next person in the chain to do their bit. So they do this anyway today about your product or the objects they created or manage in it. And so it's just so universal and a natural way to reach into the non-core users that has that network effect, and people want it and do it anyway today. And now they know how to use it. So you should just build comms into your product to create team-led growth. But here lies the fallacy as well, because all communication is not created equal. The bar to clear for comfortable communication today is high. We're 7 years into Slack, and people expect a lot from a communication tool. So look, you have the huge, enormous, unique advantage that your tool contains the context. They want to communicate about the thing that's there on the screen, right? But it just won't work if they can't do what they're used to doing today in Slack. We don't have a ton of time left, but a brief list is they need to be able to attach files of different kinds and copy and paste them easily into the chat. They need to be able to point at the screen, specifying where on your complex SaaS page or chart or table they want to draw attention with their comment. They need to @mention people and need to know that these people saw it, even if they're outside the tool in Slack or email. But if these people are spammed by your tool without a way to control or customize notifications, they're not going to use it. They're sometimes on the tool at the same time. Can they see each other? Can they tell who was there last and when? They need this because otherwise they're stuck with this feeling of, well, I asked yesterday and I didn't get a reply. Should I ask again because they didn't see it? Or did they just look at it and it'll be rude to ask again? That's what we call presence. And the messages need to be threaded and resolvable and searchable and ideally pinnable, or they're not going to trust that they can really keep their org's decisions and comms there. And then there's all the fiddly bits and design details, like how eliding long messages works. That's the technical messaging term for that see more that you see when that really, really chatty person on the team gives a 4-page long answer. Or replying to the message from email or Slack. Not to mention actually editing your SaaS object together, seeing who's editing what, managing the tasks from your tool. So for communication to work as a TLG mechanism, it also needs a lot of thought and work. And look, I'm not gonna say you have to do all of this. Even Figma and Notion aren't perfect there. But, well, definitely don't do this and expect to win users over to collaborate in your product. This is what Looker launched as collaboration. It's a clunky share to Slack dialogue that takes the full screen. You have to input a title and a message in a way that no one will ever do, where you can't format it and you can't mention and you can't see how it look like and you can't see the conversation that ensues. Why would I ever use it over taking a screenshot? And how does it help bring retention and expansion to Looker? All right, so I think we're ready to wrap it up and make just some general comments and observations. So first of all, we talked about the epochs of sales motion, sales-led, product-led, and team-led, and I think more broadly, there's actually a deeper movement here. You see, back before SaaS and cloud-based SaaS became a thing, the software was an app separate from the data it worked on. The documents were files, and you had to send them around and put them in a network drive and attach them to emails and stuff. There was the what are you working on, how or what tool do you use, and who do you work with. Cloud SaaS used the penetration of the web and the growing sophistication of browsers to mainly connect the tool with the data, the what and the how. And there are two constituents that gain from this, the users and the vendors, which is why it was so quickly and broadly adopted. The users got a much easier, nicer to use tool that always had the data available for everyone, and it wasn't separate and forced you to fiddle with files and folders too much. But the vendors also benefited from greater lock-in and not having to worry about old versions and compatibility and so on. But communication still stayed separate and meant there's all these problems of screenshots and links all over and that inefficiency. And what we're seeing now is the wave of connecting the who, bringing the communication into the tool. And again, like in all inevitable revolutions, both sides benefit. So both sides push for it. The users get more comfortable, easy to use tools where the communication is in context. And the vendors get a wider base of users that are stickier and retain longer, because ripping out a tool for a competitor also means losing the organizational memory, the decisions made, and the process documentation, and so on. Second is pricing. So what happens with communication is it pulls in identity. You need a name and a profile picture of a person to talk to, so you have to have a separate seat per collaborator, which means if that seat costs the user money, you're going to put a speed bump on collaboration. And I think the smart products see that, and they see that the value gained in retention and brand recognition and so on is more than covering for the value lost in forsaken revenue from not charging for the communicating viewer-only seats, who wouldn't have been your core users anyway. In fact, what happens in practice is because collaboration enforces identity, it reduces seat sharing in tools that otherwise had just no reason to really have a separate user. Anyone could just log in with the same account. Now, the tools that charge based on value, they're good. They can just auto-provision these free seats for the collaborators and invitees. The tools that charge per seat would really benefit from turning their thinking to maximizing retention and give out some kind of viewer-only seat or a resource-limited seat so you can collaborate but only on the few pages you're invited to, or something like that. Lastly, I want to address a question that I always get asked, which is, so can any SaaS tool add collaboration? And the answer is no, though most can. The thing with communicating in product is that you need a team to communicate with. So if there are tools that are genuinely single actor, and there aren't many examples of this in B2B, but if there's like a SaaS for independent ice cream van drivers to manage their inventory, well, if the tool really addresses one person per company, then probably it doesn't work. But that applies also if there are very, very sparse, kind of few people, where most companies have one of these roles who works alone and only the very big have a few. Then, if the tool is used by many people, but just very, very rarely, then communication just won't tend to happen in the tool. It's a new habit to pick up, it's a tough sell. So if it's like, I don't know, it's like a Carta and you go there once every 6 months to sign an equity grant, well, maybe it's not as effective to have communication in there. And I mean, Carta's growth is pretty much covered by being an HR tool that's rolled out to all employees anyway. But for most tools used by teams, at least monthly or weekly, then what happens when you add collaboration is that usage frequency and number of users increase. Great. So congratulations on picking up this toolkit of team-led growth. And you now have the framework of how to grow seats and retention by using invites and communication inside your product. Remember that in team-led growth, we prioritize exposure to your product through invites and multiple intra-org surfaces, expanding your use case to include other stakeholders, creating network effects and reliance on multiple people to get a job done, and that communication in product is probably a great starting point. Every single vertical in SaaS will have a winner that was collaboration first or won the collaboration game. That's what we're seeing. So if you want to get there faster, Typeform just added collaboration for all of their users with Cord in a couple of weeks. What we do is we geek out over these things and we spend stupid money and time just making collaboration in context the best possible experience. Good luck.